Bend, Indiana. My name is Colin Barr. I'm a senior lecturer in history at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. And at the moment, I am the first visiting faculty fellow at the Clingen Family Centre for the Study of Modern Ireland, which is a part of the Keough-Naughton Institute for Irish Studies here at Notre Dame. And this today is the first in a series of what we're calling conversations in the humanities, culture, and public policy. And these conversations have the intention of contributing to the debates, questions, issues of relevance to contemporary Ireland, and to bring academics into conversation with journalists, politicians, lawyers, novelists, members of civil society, both North and South in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, with a view to tackling some of the contemporary issues today. And with all of that said, I'm very excited to introduce the first of these conversations, which is on historical memory and public policy in modern Ireland. And I'll introduce our panel to you in just a moment. But first, just some small housekeeping details. We're very excited to have many of you joining us from all over the world. This will be recorded and you can watch it back later or pass the link on to your friends. And please feel free to send that out by social media and so forth. We'll also be very pleased to take questions. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A function. If you just type your question into that, those will be made aware to me, and I'll try and introduce as many of those questions as I can to our panelists, both at the end of the hour and also as they occur through our conversation as it develops. So please don't be shy, put your questions in the Q&A in the bottom, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can. So having said all of that, it's a really great pleasure to welcome our panel today for the first of these Clingen Center conversations. Our first panelist is Elaine Loughlin. She's currently the Deputy Political Editor of the Irish Examiner, where she covers mainly politics, being deputy political editor, but also has an interest in social issues, the Irish language, gender equality issues. Now, she's worked for the Examiner for over 5 years and also regularly contributes to radio and television, current affairs programs, and has previously worked in the Irish Daily Mail, the Belfast Telegraph, the Irish Sun, and slightly more exotically, the Irish Echo in Australia. We're also joined by Laura McAtackney, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Archaeology and Heritage Studies at Aarhus University in Denmark. She also teaches in a Finnish university. Now, her research uses contemporary archaeology and critical heritage approaches to explore social justice issues, including long-term studies on political imprisonment in Ireland, Longcash Maze Prison, and produced a fantastic book in 2014 with the Oxford University Press called An Archaeology of the Troubles, which looked, I think your phrase, Laura, was the dark heritage of the maze in Longcash. That was a wonderful subtitle that caught things very well. She also works on gendered institutions, especially Magdalene laundries, post-conflict Northern Ireland, especially materialized segregation, and the experiences and memory of the colonial Caribbean. And I noticed an article, Laura, on why they have St. Patrick's Day in Montserrat, which I will go back and read later because I think that would be very interesting. Laura is currently the principal investigator for an independent research fund Denmark Project 2 collaboration, Enduring Materialities of Colonialism, Temporality, Spatiality, and Memory on St. Croix, the US Virgin Islands, as well as a co-investigator on an EU project looking at the potential of archaeological tourism. And she is also part of the Open Heart City Collective, which works on the physicality and the space of the Magdalene laundries in Ireland. We're also joined by two of my colleagues at Notre Dame here in the Keough-Naughton Institute, for Irish Studies. Brina Nick-Dermada is the Thomas J. and Kathleen M. O'Donnell Professor of Irish Studies and concurrent Professor of Film, Television, and Theatre here at Notre Dame, in addition to writing over 35 screenplays and some 10 documentaries. Professor Nick-Dermada is also the originator, writer, producer, and executive producer of the award-winning multi-part documentary series on the Easter Rising, 1916 Easter Rebellion, and its 86-minute feature version, both of which were narrated, very memorably so, by Liam Neeson. Now, these were broadcast, and screened internationally throughout 2016 and 2017. I'm sure many of you have seen them. Brina is also the author of the companion book, The 1916 Irish Rebellion, which was published by Notre Dame Press, and is the author of a wide variety of articles on Irish language and culture, and she is an editor of the Field Day Anthology. Last but certainly not least, my colleague Barry McCrae, also here at the University of Notre Dame and the Keough-Naughton Institute, is a novelist and scholar of modern European, Latin American, and Irish literature. His most recent book is Languages of the Night, Minor Languages and the Literary Imagination in 20th Century Ireland and Europe, which was published by Yale in 2015, which won the American Comparative Literature Association's Renee Wellick Prize for the Best Book of 2016. He's the author, among other things, of First Verse, a novel, the winner of a number of awards, including the 2006 Farrow Grumley Prize for Fiction and a Barnes & Noble Discover Prize, and also the author of In the Company of Strangers, Narrative and Family in Dickens, Conan Doyle, Joyce, and Proust, published by Columbia in 2011, which won the Yale Heyman Prize for Scholarship in the Humanities. With all of that said, I think I'd like to begin, if I may, with you, Elaine, because it was you in January, earlier this year, who really broke the story that many of you will have seen about the apparent, at the time, destruction of witness testimony, of recordings of witness testimony to the mother and baby home inquiry in the Republic of Ireland. And then in a series of, I thought, really fascinating stories over the next several weeks, really teased out a lot of the implications of that, the different ways in which the survivors responded, how their experience of this was conditioned by what they felt had been the treatment of their memories and their testimony, and the various issues of law, of politics, and of the commission's itself needs. And I was wondering if you could just begin by telling us a bit about how you came to that story and how that developed as you saw it, as you were writing it and investigating it for us.
Well, as people know, the commission, the Mother and Baby Homes Commission of Investigation, the final report of that was published in January of this year. It was a significant report, both in its conclusions and the actual size of the report. It was almost 3,000 pages in length, and even the executive summary ran to, I think, 76 pages. So it was an unwieldy report to kind of get your head round to start off with. And I know that's what some of the survivors had said, that it took a significant amount of time for them to digest what was in the report. So as a reporter, you get the report, you look through it as best you can on the day, and obviously it wasn't possible to go through the 3,000 pages in a single day or even a single week. So it was about looking at it, trying to take what were the most significant elements and conclusions of that report on the day and the following days. So it wasn't really until perhaps a week or two after, from going back through the report itself, from speaking to survivors, from speaking to those involved with the issue for many years. And we have to remember that this commission of investigation was running for 5 years, and it had come after a lot of campaigning, both from those who had been resident in mother and baby homes, and also from journalists like Catherine Corliss and my own former colleague as well, Conal O'Faherty. So there was a built-up expectation around the publication of this. So again, when I did go back and maybe analyse further some of the chapters, and in particular the chapter on the confidential committee, and that committee was set up to get the views, the experiences and the opinions of those who were either born in these institutions, who gave birth there, or perhaps were involved for other reasons. They may have worked there, they may have supplied products there. If they had an involvement and they wish to come forward with their experiences, they were entitled to. So that commission, or that confidential committee, heard from 550 people. The chapter on that specific body of work had one line in it which caught my attention on second reading, and it was that the recordings, the 550 interviews, the recordings of those had been destroyed afterwards. So I followed up with the Commission of Investigation and discovered that not only had they been destroyed, that no verbatim transcript had been taken of these interviews. And that came as a surprise to some of those who'd actually given their testimony, and in some cases it had been the first time where survivors had spoken of what had happened to them, and the impact that it had on them. So it was a significant piece of information for them to take in initially, and then obviously they wanted to see if that destruction could be in any way altered to retrieve those files. And that's essentially what happened for the following few weeks until the Commission of Investigation was wound up at the end of February. It was a significant amount of campaigning, both from survivor groups and from a number of politicians, and pressure was put on the Children's Minister to do so. And there was a lot of toing and froing between the Commission of Investigation and the Minister for Children to see if that could be done. And in the end, backup files were found. We know that it's very difficult these days to fully erase any sort of or any digital recording, and those recordings were retrieved just days before the Commission of Investigation was due to wind up.
Thanks, Elaine. That's really interesting. Just before I turn to the other panel, so I just wanted to ask you briefly, how did you, as you were talking to people involved with the commission and saying, it seems like these have been destroyed, was there a sense that they were surprised by your inquiry, that this had not occurred to them as something that might be of interest, that there was a lack of reflection in any sense? As what was the response as you began to ask your questions and make your inquiries?
Yeah, well, I suppose commissions of investigations are set up and they have strict parameters, terms of reference as to what they can report on or what they can look into and how they report that. And I know that some survivors had expressed a real disappointment and anger almost that in the wording and the way the Commission of Investigation had formulated, I suppose, the report. But it is a legal document. It is done, as I said, within those parameters, and they have to stick to those. And perhaps the responses that I received reflect that it was. I received very matter-of-fact responses confirming that yes, the document or the recordings had been destroyed and no verbatim transcripts had been taken, and that was outlined in the Commission of Investigation report, or at least the destruction of files was. Now they did not specify in the Commission of Investigation's final report that they hadn't followed up with a verbatim transcript. They indicated that they had taken notes. We do know that there was a tick boxing form, shall I say, filled out for each of those 550 people to correlate all of the information gathered, but it wasn't a specific transcript that was taken of those recordings.
Interesting, thanks for that. I think that's an important point that I want to touch on as we go through the conversation today. That sense of surprise. Yes, indeed, we did do that. Why do you ask almost? Is going to be an interesting one. And as we think about how these inquiries are best conducted, what the different needs are, which I think is a theme that everybody will speak to. If I could, just starting from that, turn to you, Laura, for a moment. I want to pick up on your expertise in Northern Ireland, because obviously there is a separate series of processes that have been going on both in the past in Northern Ireland from its earlier inquiry, which I believe was started in 2013. The Historic Institutional Abuse Inquiry, which has reported, but there's now a new process, which is actually, and it struck me when you and I were speaking about this, as a new way of doing things, which maybe speaks to some of the things Elaine was just addressing, where there is what they're calling a truth recovery design team to establish the terms of reference that Elaine very correctly points out guides these inquiries. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on in Northern Ireland, what has gone on with previous inquiries, and if you see an awareness, as it were, between the two jurisdictions about lessons learned, and if you think this new truth recovery design team is a new model and a good one?
Yes, so obviously institutional abuse is something that has been investigated in both parts of Ireland because obviously it happened in both parts. One thing I think that is a real problem with the focus on legal jurisdictions and these being government initiated is that often the border and partition then becomes the main focus. So despite the fact that the Catholic Church was an all-Ireland entity and worked as an all-Ireland entity, So for example, the Magdalene laundries, there was 3 in Northern Ireland as well as the 10 in the Republic of Ireland. And the 3 in Northern Ireland were run by the Good Shepherd sisters, which was the same as the ones in a number of them in the Republic of Ireland. So there is a lot of crossover that doesn't get discussed because there's a legal framework which is based on the law of 2 different jurisdictions, which is why I think history is really, important to look at these issues, because we don't have to look at it in that way where it's formulated from a legal standpoint. We can look at it from a historical standpoint of how these places actually functioned. So as you said, there's been a number of historic abuse inquiries in Northern Ireland. The most recent one actually reported also in January 2021, which was the Mother and Baby Home and Magdalene Laundry report. It was a smaller, and it didn't have the same remit or the same terms of reference as in the Republic of Ireland, but actually it was quite interesting in terms of the focus of the personnel. And I think this is another issue that historians, need to think about, that there's different types of historians. So obviously the types of historians who were involved in the report that was created in January one was a social historian, a gender historian, Leanne McCormick, and the other was Sean O'Connell, who's an oral historian. So they had an equal focus on archives and oral testimonies as being focal points for these inquiries. And from what's come from that, the First Minister reported in January on this, and the executive had already decided that they will have a new inquiry, which is going to be specifically victim-centred and independent. It's going to be co-designed with victims and survivors, and they will have the ability to influence the aims of the investigations and everything that happens within it. And I think that's really important in terms of looking at inquiries where we already have a baseline of knowing that there was an issue of abuse and abuse of power and various other forms of abuse, that actually we focus on the victims and survivors as being, creators of the knowledge, not just having a right to narration, but actually having a right to contribute to what we know about the past. I should say that both reports in terms of references have emphasized experience being really important. And as the report in the North quoted, living conditions are difficult to ascertain from archives. Very little was recorded about them. So oral testimonies are really important because they provide great insights into the lived experience of these institutions. And that was written into both of those reports, but they've went about them in very different ways because of the emphasis on different types of history.
The inevitable, you're still muted. You think after all this time I would have learned that. It seems not. That's very interesting, Laura. Thank you for that. I think one of the things we can pick up on as well is this question of different kinds of history, the character of oral testimony in particular. And as you were talking, I was thinking, Brina, this might be a question I would put to you as a documentarian, where you are investigating things through a medium, through film, where you're listening almost necessarily or attentive to oral testimony, but also other kinds of records to tell a narrative. And I'm wondering if you see any overlaps, some of the techniques or challenges you faced making documentary films, to how we might approach the issue of testimony and recovering historical events through this prism. I don't know if that's an entirely unfair question. I know I didn't tell you about that one in advance.
Which I'll have a shot anyway. Yeah, no, I think that the conversation has been very, very interesting, and it's brought up a few points. But this thing about testament, certainly making a documentary, you have to have your narrative. You're telling your story, and what we call first-person narratives, witness statements, witness accounts, where somebody sits down, looks into a camera, or looks in the eye of another person and tells their story. It's incredibly moving. It's incredibly compelling, and it works both ways. It has both. It makes compelling viewing. It brings people in, the audience, into the story, so you can best understand what this person has gone through. For the person telling their story, they feel witnessed, they feel heard. So it's part of what I suppose some people would call a healing process, perhaps, or at the very least, they find that their voices are being heard. However, having said that, I think also an overemphasis on that can lead us down cul-de-sacs, that are ultimately frustrating. So, for example, if you look at that whole furore about the commission into the mother and babies home, that was, as Elaine was saying there, delineated the whole thing, 3,000 pages, five years work by very particular kinds of people, by a judge, by a very eminent historian. and another judge, I think, another legal person. So what were they doing? They were not therapists. They were not about any kind of archival purpose. They weren't about any therapeutic purpose. Their remit was very specific and limited, and couched, of course, in legalese or very academic, dry language. And this, more than anything, I think, upset the survivors. In a sense, they weren't almost able to hear what was being said in the report because of the way it was couched, because they were expecting something else. So basically what I'm saying is I think we need to be very careful when we set up these inquiries to realize that they are limited. They're limited in value. We need to go beyond that. But for example, that report was actually very hard hitting. I was just reading back up, and the Guardian, the English Guardian, what used to be the Manchester Guardian, the day the report came out said this: the report chronicles deprivation, misogyny, stigma, and in some cases, shocking levels of infant mortality, adding up to a blistering indictment, not just of the institutions, but the wider culture of oppression that sustained them. Now, I think sometimes, when we get caught up in very interesting, almost citrus, and I don't mean, Elaine, to say that the issue of these, the destruction of the testimonies, is a citrus, a hugely important issue. But sometimes when we follow down those paths, we don't actually hear that indictment. We don't actually, we're not talking about the 900 children that died in those awful places, or that in Bessborough and Cork, for example, or the 796 children who died up in the Tuam Mother and Babies Home. Having said all that, it's extremely hard, I think. Once these wrongs have been committed, it's extremely hard to make them right. In a sense, you can't. There is a hole that can never be filled, except perhaps by now, obviously compensation will help. I think one of the things that came out of the McAleese report into the Magdalene laundries in 2013, they talked there about restorative justice. The government of the day brought in Judge Quirk to make recommendations. He did so. These were welcomed by survivors at the time, but by 5 years later, they weren't implemented. So again, there's very little, we hear this. This is, I think, what lends impetus to the anger and the frustration and the upset of the survivors, the time and time again. They aren't really listened to. So I think we need to go beyond just legal inquiries. I think we need to set in a whole idea of memorialization, for example, that they talk about, restorative justice, memorialization. And I think compensation is at the heart of this, realizing we can never go back and give these people what was taken from them. It's a really complex issue.
I think that's an important issue, Brina. And I think I was thinking as you were speaking, and I wonder, Elaine, if I could just turn briefly back to you for a moment. When you were speaking to survivors and you were talking to them in the context of writing your stories, in particular, as you were discussing with them their feelings about having what appeared to be the destruction of their testimony or the failure to record it in the way they were looking for, did any of them articulate to you what they had been looking for in this process, what their expectation was? Was this to be heard, to be seen? And did they put, any of them, as you spoke to, put meaning around that in the sense that this is what I expected and I got this, but not that? Was that a conversation you had?
Yes, certainly that did come across strongly from a lot of the survivors and campaigning groups. Indeed, a lot of them had said that, and it does come down to how commissions of investigation can treat evidence and how they can report on it, and it does have to be phrased and couched, as Brianna said, in a certain way because it is a certain document and a certain type of document. But they felt that there was a lot of their testimony that was questioned. For instance, some of the Commission Investigation report says that they questioned some of the witness testimony because they were concerned over cross-contamination, and they mentioned that perhaps survivors may have spoken to each other and therefore had not perhaps remembered instances correctly, or had remembered them as their own something that happened themselves, but actually it was perhaps because they spoke to other survivors that they thought that. But they felt that that level of questioning and querying of evidence was not given to perhaps the church or other authorities that were also investigated as part of this commission investigation. So that was one of the elements that they felt that perhaps their voices weren't heard. And as Brianna says, this is not an exercise in therapy, and it wasn't that sort of a process. But I think because it took 5 years, and there was, apart from the interim reports that came out sporadically during that time, there was no indication as to what might happen at the very end of this process. And so there was a lot of pressure built up and a lot of expectation built up towards the end of this. And then when survivors perhaps felt that it didn't go as far as it could have, or they believed should have, they were very disappointed. And a few of the conclusions in that initial executive summary perhaps didn't actually reflect the entire report. And that was also an issue because, as I said, when you have a 3,000 word or page report, you might only get to read the executive summary on day one, and then you might go into the other elements of it. Or perhaps survivors, if they were a survivor of Bessborough, may have read the executive summary and then read the Bessborough chapter and found that the executive summary may have said no instances of abuse were found. And then there was first person testimony of, for example, a woman said that she was forced to scrub a stairs just hours after she gave birth, and stitches broke, and it was a terrible experience. So they felt that the executive summary perhaps didn't reflect both their experiences and what was detailed in the wider report. So there was that kind of element. Another issue with the specific instance of those 550 transcripts or audio recordings being destroyed was they felt that this is a primary resource. And this is a historical document. It will become a historical document. And they felt it didn't quite reflect what they believed or their reality. And the only way that that would be reflected was through these recordings, which were now not available. So if you're talking from a historian's point of view, and I'm not a historian, but to have that primary resource in years to come would be invaluable, I'm guessing. And they felt because that was no longer in existence, that was a treasure trove that essentially had been thrown away.
That's fascinating. I think I'd like to pick up, if I could, this idea that the distress at being, the sense of being questioned, and the idea that survivors felt of being interrogated in a way that perhaps wasn't addressed to some of the other, particularly the Catholic Church, but other participants in the inquiry or other subjects of the inquiry. I wonder, Barry, if I could turn to you, and I'm thinking about some of the conversations I've had with you around earlier work on Holocaust survivors and their testimony. And how do you think we have to engage with this idea of questioning, or do we question, or how do you question memory, traumatic memory of people who have clearly suffered very terrible things, but in a context where accuracy or ideas of fact are not essentially trying to achieve the same things? And I'm wondering if there's any insights we can take from the experience of the much longer experience of inquiries into the Holocaust that you think might be relevant to this kind of conversation.
Well, we have learned a lot from that, not only the Holocaust, but also other survivors of traumatic experiences, victims of sexual violence, or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And one of the things we know is that the kind of narrative that survivors spontaneously come up with is different from what a historian would find. And I think it's very important that we have all of those types of testimony available to us. So the kind of hard facts and numbers that historians and journalists can give us, and then the unfettered accounts of people who experienced it themselves. And they're not going to be the same thing. And just as I think we can't put the burden on historians of being therapists or of providing a document that is going to make amends, the job of the historians is to produce some sort of attempt to factual accuracy. But just as we can't put that burden, and then we also can't put on survivors the burden of historical accuracy when they are testifying as to what they experienced. And it's extremely important to remember that. There's a famous example in the Yale Holocaust Archive of somebody who is testifying about the Sonderkommando rebellion in Auschwitz, and the survivor remembers 4 chimneys, the chimneys of the 4 crematoriums being blown up. And the historians responded to this, saying that only one of the chimneys was blown up. And there's a whole series by Dory Laub, especially, was the person who wrote about this from a kind of psychoanalytic perspective. There is a sense in which to challenge this survivor by saying, no, it's one chimney, it's one chimney, it's one chimney, has the effect of distorting her testimony rather than adding to it. So what we need is both things, the historian who says, well, there was one chimney, and the survivor who gives us the full color memory that she has, which says 4 chimneys, but this could mean it's a way of describing an experience, a way of recording an experience that also has a dignity and importance to it too. The other part of this, is that what we're all talking about is how to reconstruct a historical moment. And any historical moment is made up of a multiplicity of voices. Not all of those voices make it into the future. Some of them are muted, and it's very difficult to recover them. And especially, it's very difficult to recover them in their original multiplicity. And in that sense, it's also very important that we turn down as much as we can the volume of on our current debates, in which we, and also the current systems of belief that we have, that we're political ideas that we're operating under, to try and, as much as we can, turn that down and turn up the volume on what are often very strange voices that the past has to give to us. And I can think an analogy came to mind recently. It's from a different area of experience, but a close friend of mine was remembering in 1995, he was about to come out as gay, in Ireland, went to a kind of youth group in the evening, a gay youth group with his friend. They all went to Bewley's Cafe in Grafton Street afterwards for a kind of coffee afterwards. And one person in the group was a sort of very flamboyant, effeminate guy who was making all of these camp jokes and so on. And another guy sitting at a different table having coffee with his girlfriend marched over to the table and just punched the flamboyant fellow in the face. And my friend told me that walking home with his friend, the two of them gay, there in order to prepare their coming out, one of the things they agreed on walking home in 1995 was that the guy who was punched should have been quieter. That was the first thing they thought, that he shouldn't have been so loud, he shouldn't have been so flamboyant. So if you wanted to understand that moment, it's not enough to go in and drag out the guy who threw the punch, who I suspect may well have voted for marriage equality in the referendum. Very possibly he voted for gay marriage. It's not enough to just pull out the guy who threw the punch or the person who received the punch. You'd also have to talk to the girlfriend, to the gay people at the table who thought that the punching was sort of justified, to all of the other people in the cafe. This is all to say that a multiplicity of voices and perspectives go into the making up of any historical moment, and we can't just listen to one channel, if you like. We have to have all of the audio open, all of the channels open, and listen to them.
If I could just, because I think that's a fascinating analogy, and I'm just wondering if we think, at what point does multiple channels, lowering the volume and listening to the multiple channels, does that not too run the risk of becoming a cacophony? That you simply cannot pick and select. There has to be an extra, and you alluded to this earlier, some voices don't go to or some narratives don't go forward to the future. How do we better select, to continue your image, which channels we have to record, which channels of information we have to pay particular attention to, and who adjudicates that?
Well, I suppose the first thing is to go in listening rather than speaking. I know that sounds like a platitude, but I think it's very important that we have to allow the past to speak to us, including in the ways in which it's strange or unpleasant to hear. And then we have to divide, I think, the roles. And this comes back to something Brianna was saying earlier, that a commission run by judges, lawyers, and historians is very different from the collecting of individual spontaneous testimony. And that's why, as Elaine was saying, it's a tragedy that any of that testimony would be destroyed. It's absolutely vital that we have it, not just as a supplement to the historical archive, but as a fundamental part of it. And it doesn't have to reach the same conclusions. They don't have to all agree on the facts, but they do all have to be present if the past is to speak to us with any coherence.
Thanks, Barry. That's fascinating. Laura, if I could just turn to you for a moment. I want to pick up on your work, your earlier work on Northern Ireland, Long Kesh, and the Maze. And just as I was listening to Barry speak, I wonder if you get the sense, or working on a different kind of memory involving political violence, or the outcomes or consequences of political violence, does that set up for you, or do you get the impression that sets up a different body of expectations for survivors and victims? Is that a different approach on the part of the state to how this gets interrogated? Does it bring in a different set of challenges for preserving or interpreting this information? Do you see these as essentially parallel or analogous processes? Are they different? And should they be if they are?
Yeah, well, those are very good questions. Particularly, whenever we're working with the recent past, we're obviously working with people who are alive, who were involved in that recent past, and we can't ignore their role in it and their opinions. Particularly because memory, as Barry said, has a number of issues in terms of how accurate it is, but there's also issues with archival records and how much they represent the past too. So we must remember that archival records are created for particular functions, which are not about historians picking through them. They're essentially record keeping. They're essentially, rules and regulations and control. So we always have to work with all our evidence of the past, the situated knowledge. So my background working, in the recent past in Northern Ireland, but also in the more distant past in the Republic of Ireland. So I've worked in prisons in different contexts. And what I became really interested in is how we look at different sources and methods and how we synthesize those in different ways. So, we have to know the different types of sources we have for the past and what they tell us about the past, but then always be aware that we can never retrieve the past. We can just work with what we have in the present and then try to get to some kind of, understanding about what this tells us. So my particular interest is in material culture, and that's why my interest in terms of historical memory is also how do we retain memory as a nation? How do we ensure we don't forget these stories, which is why it was so important not to get rid of people's stories, as well as the archives, which, are more carefully looked after. But, how do we move forward in terms of memorialization processes? And that's really important for survivors and for victims, that they, that we bring this into our national memory in different ways, in terms of education, in terms of preserving, in terms of national, museum collections, which is also, been a discussion in terms of how do we remember the early 20th century. I was at a book launch on Monday, which was about women in the decade of, centenaries. And one of the writers had talked about how it was so hard to put museum exhibitions on about women's history from the early 20th century because we don't have a lot of artifacts in museums of women. So we're trying to put together things that we didn't keep. So I think that's really something I'm hyper conscious of, is how do we ensure we keep as much as we can from these moments while we have survivors, while we have material remains, while we have all these other sources.
That's fascinating. I wonder, Brina, I wonder if I could just turn to you as well, thinking about Laura's point about memorialization and the decade of commemoration. You, of course, have contributed to the decade of commemoration in a very important way with a very high-profile film in 1916. Do some of the issues that have been addressed in Ireland as it works through this period, and some of the challenges, do you think, about how memorialization, in this case, is a much more distant set of events and traumas, does this have lessons for how Ireland today can approach these sorts of traumas and the needs of memorialization outside of a legal process like a tribunal?
Absolutely, Colin. One of the things I remember when I began with Chris Fox, indeed, to explore the idea of doing a documentary series on 1916. Given that we were in the States, we were an American university, albeit with strong Irish connections, but it gave us that perspective. It gave us that bit of space. It was like almost putting the camera right back and see well, what questions would you ask if you look from this distance, as opposed to in there, in an insular way in which we perceived, particularly that period of our history, the revolutionary period. And the other thing I always thought of when we were beginning to develop a style for this was to be the point of a circle. It was like almost a journey around my father, a journey around 1916, so that you actually listened to and got perspectives from each side. And in a sense, you presented those and then let the audience make up their minds, basically. Obviously, we had to be factually accurate. But apart from that, you let people tell their stories. So what Barry was saying about that plurality of voices, I think it's hugely important that we have that, but also in a variety of fora. I think obviously there's a burden of proof if you're going into a legal situation in a courtroom or these commissions, these legal commissions and investigations, there's a particular burden of proof. But I think other fora, I mean, if you look at the most compelling stories of these Magdalene laundries and these mother and baby homes, for me, the 1998 documentary, Sex in a Cold Climate, it was really that story of those 4 women who broke it. And of course, Peter Mullen then based his really, I mean, I've been watching it again with one of my classes at the moment. And it's, oh my God, it is so traumatizing to watch that, his dramatization of the story of the 4 women. In fact, it is almost more effective because obviously he uses film techniques. So you could say that's not true, these girls weren't called that. But I suppose there's this thing between facts and truth. I don't want to go obviously too far down that road, that facts are unimportant, they're not. But there's something about, like, for example, the fact that only 1 chimney in Auschwitz was blown up when that person remembered, so I remembered 4. But he got the truth of it. I'm sure in the telling of that, he or she got the truth of what happened in Auschwitz, you know? And I think actually documentary is a really, really good medium for that. I think obviously film as well, because you can get that plurality of voices. You know, I think to go back to Laura, what you were talking about, say the maids, I remember looking at a documentary about the hunger strikes, for example, and they had some, well, obviously not the hunger strikers who died, patently, but they had people who've been on hunger strike, Lawrence McKeown, for example, who became a filmmaker himself and was an author and wrote about his experiences. But he talked about being 60 days or 66 days, whatever amount of time he was on hunger strike. You also had loyalist prisoners talking about it. You also had prison officers talking. They were in the same place at the same time, and yet their lived experiences, as we call it now, was totally different. So how do you accommodate all of that in one seamless narrative? I don't think you can. I think you have to allow for that plurality. So it's very complex, but I think we definitely need to look at creative ways of doing that, of giving people voices, allowing their voices to be heard. And there always is manipulation involved, isn't there? There's always editing. Someone has to put the tape recorder to somebody's face. Somebody has to put the camera on you and start recording. So, you know, it's always going to be edited. You know, people are going to decide who to put in, who to leave out. But I do think we need to focus on that plurality, on the fact that we're multivocal. Like for example, I know there were 1 or 2 women in those Magdalene laundries who said, you know, I had a great time there with the nuns. Are they telling? Are we going to? You know, how do you weight that? So these are not easy questions. These are very difficult questions, I think.
I wonder if I could just follow on from that with you, if I may. I'm wondering if a model, and this is just sort of a hazy idea that occurred to me as you were speaking, is in future tribunals and future inquiries, in which there will definitely be some in not just in Ireland, but elsewhere, is the model that needs to happen is a plural model, where there is a legal inquiry that needs to do the things that a legal inquiry has to do in the ways that it does, as it were, to look at the number of chimneys in Auschwitz, to continue that model, that image. But also it is actually structured to have documentary input, where there are trained documentarians who are recording this testimony, who are preserving it, where there is a chance for the survivors to be heard in a more unmediated way, or at least in a distinct way, as well as perhaps historians being involved. Is this, do you think, a model that could be structured?
I think so. I think what a legal tribunal or a commission of inquiry can do, or investigation can do, is establish the facts as much as can be done, obviously, because you're going back into the past, to establish the facts. I think what these other fora, for want of a better word, can do is to add the truth to those facts. the people's experiences, what it felt like to be in those awful places, what it felt like to be told, well, actually, for 50 years, you thought you were Johnny Murphy and your mum and dad were Annie and Mikey, and actually, do you know what, you're not. Suddenly, for that to be hit at you, no matter what kind of legal inquiry, that's not going to ever get the truth of those feelings. So I think we do. I think film is great. It's very, very vivid and compelling way of letting people tell their stories. I think also literature, creative writing, stuff like that. But also archive, also history, oral history. I think another. So I think it has to be multi-layered, many-layered, and multifocal.
Which might perhaps be a way of avoiding some of the sense of being challenged or not being heard that comes from survivors when their primary mediation of their testimony is through a legal process, perhaps.
Exactly, because you don't have the burden of proof you have, and you have to have that in the court of law or in some sort of legal thing. So therefore you do have to question. Whereas in something that is more either therapeutic or more about listening to people's stories, you're not saying they're not true, but you're giving them the ability to be heard, which I think is hugely important.
Just very briefly, we have some questions, and I'd like to turn to those in a moment. I just want to pick up on one, as you were listing the various different things that need to be done. And one struck me just from conversations I know with you, Laura, on some of your projects about the physical spaces being preserved. I remember having a previous conversation when you described to me actually visiting one of the Magdalene laundry sites and how unkept and unpreserved and how physically threatened it was. And the importance also of observing the material spaces. I wonder if you could just say a little bit about how you see the materiality of these places and the sites of these events and traumas as part of this process that we're now describing as augmenting the legal process.
Yeah, I think the places and the materials, connected to these places are hugely important, particularly now where we don't have that many left. We only have 3 Magdalene laundries left that have not been completely either regenerated or demolished. The one in Cork actually is really not in any fit condition for preservation. So there's only really 2 in Dublin. And I've been into both of them, and they're hugely evocative places. They're very different places because of what's left of them as well. But they're really powerful, and I think they ensure that we retain a public memory of what happened in these places. If we actually we don't have to keep all of them. Obviously, there's no way that you can keep every institution that ever existed in Ireland. Because there's just too much, and there's also a saturation of memory. But we do have, for survivors, I think there's a right for them to consider that their past gets retained somewhere, that they have a right to narrate their stories about it, and that also we put other places in those. So the idea of a site of conscience is quite important now, how to articulate these places rather than just make them like a museum of misery. Then we think of them as places where we start to make changes. So one of the ideas in terms of the Open Hearts City project is to look at somewhere like Sean McDermott Street, which is in central Dublin, which is in an area that needs regenerated. But it's also, there's space there to do other things, like create an archive that, which is a recommendation of the report, is to bring together all these materials from different sources so they're all in one place, but to allow people to create their own stories and make sure that the paperwork that they have found from all these other places are in there. And also what's really important is that, there's still a problem with people who were adopted from these institutions not being able to access their own identity. And that's also brought up in the report, that everyone has a human right, has a right to, know where they were born and to have the materials associated with that. And so these should be places that are about transitions, about transitional justice, and about remembering, but also not just about remembering, ensuring that the changes continue into the future.
I think that's an important point. Indeed, one of our questions was about the challenges that many of these children have. They simply can't obtain records of their own identity. They don't know who they were, where they were born exactly, or their parents. And that opens up an important way, I think, in which individual's identity is tied up with these experiences, and then even more complicated by the legal restrictions around that. And I'm wondering, I don't immediately know which of you to turn to with this question. So I'm just going to pick on you, Barry, I think. But this idea of identity, and I think it goes, somehow in my mind, it links to this question. We need to turn down the volume and hear and listen, but how does that work for people who don't necessarily have access to knowledge of the core of their own story? How do we navigate that terrain?
No, it's very complicated. I suppose, listening to everybody, I mean, it just strikes me that we have a lot of duties here as a society now. Our first duty is to the people who survived this experience, who have very direct needs now, including this very important one of access to documents to establish their own family histories. And that's the first one. Then we have a duty, we might call an academic duty, to the past, to allowing it to really understanding it in all its strangeness, and this is a duty, the third duty we have, which is to our own society, to preserving as much as we can, as Laura was saying, in physical buildings or archives of testimony, or perhaps a truth commission, which I think might be one of the models we could do. And it is very difficult to balance these individual needs with all of these broader, and in some cases, abstract needs. And that's, I think, as you're saying, Colin, the only way we can do it is a multi-forum approach. I think something like a truth commission, which has all room for all types of voices and approaches and methodologies in it, but also not losing sight of the fact that with the first duty we all have is to people like the person here who put her question in the Q&A there, to people who are still alive, who survived it, and have, in some instances, very immediate and pragmatic needs that need to be met as soon as possible.
So I might just turn. We have a couple of fairly specific questions, which would be great to address. I think if I can turn to you, Elaine, see if you just know the answer to this. You may not, so I'm putting you on the spot. But we have a question which is a questioner who's interested in the ethical framework in which these inquiries were conducted. Was there, and I assume there must have been a process, an ethics process. Do you know who signed off on that, who generated it, how that was regulated, and how that's governed when these kinds of reports? Is that something that's crossed your radar as you've covered this story?
Yeah, well, all commissions of investigations, and there have been numerous, and there's also some ongoing here at the moment as well, are come under the 2004 Commissions of Investigation Act. So this Commission of Investigation would have been set up under that Act. And I know that one of the issues around that Act that has been both brought up in this instance by mother and baby home activists and campaigners, and as well elected representatives, is that Act just stipulates that the Commission of Investigation be set up, it look into the matter, and the terms of reference are drawn up around the specific issue. It compiles a report, it publishes, or it gives the report to the relevant minister, and then that report is published. And after that, there is no onus on the Commission of Investigation to either comment, to come before an Oireachtas committee to answer questions, or to answer any questions from anyone, essentially. Now, there's a balancing act here, and you can understand when you have a cohort of survivors who are in some cases enraged and upset and angered by some of the elements of any report, that they may want answers. But again, you have to weigh that up with what a Commission of Investigation is set up to do, and on how far it can go. And I know some of the judiciary here as well had mentioned that it may be hard to get people to work on commissions of investigations in the future if they feel that their work will be torn apart and they will have to publicly answer, and they may come before an Oireachtas committee or a committee here in the Irish Parliament to be scrutinised on their work, and work that takes years and years and years. But another point I just wanted to follow up on, because I know when these reports are published and there's various findings and recommendations, redress is one of the ones, and I'm guilty of it myself, it's one of the ones that is reported in the media and is highlighted. And in a lot of instances, it's not the money that people want, and when we talk about survivors of mother and baby homes now, a lot of them are elderly. Unfortunately, a lot of them are already deceased. They don't want money. They don't need money. they do want their birth certs. They want to know who they are. They want to know if there's any sort of medical issues in their family that might be relevant to them now. And as well, as Laura said, they want perhaps a place to go. And the recommendations of the Commission Investigation Report do say that an information and tracing legislation is required now, that people should have access to their personal information, and also the funding should be supplied to local authorities to build memorials, whether that's, you know, a plaque on a wall or keeping an entire building in place that people can go to. And another element as well that I think will have wider implications as well is education, because these homes, the last of them closed in 1998. It's not a long time ago that babies were born here, albeit on a very small scale. But there's also a lot of people, thankfully, growing up in Ireland that have no idea that this happened to perhaps their mothers, their grandmothers, and some sort of element has to be inserted into the second level education system that young people growing up are aware of their recent history. And I think that would also be invaluable. I don't know if I answered your question there.
I think you did. I hope that gives a clear sense of the process. I think that sense of which, how do we actually interrogate and hold accountable those who are holding others accountable through the tribunal process, is a really fraught one, not one we have time to address today. I've got a number of questions here. We're not going to have time. We're coming right up against it, but I think, and this, I'll just give you a sense of what's been asked, is we have a question about how libraries can best contribute to the preservation of material and assist. I think that's an important one. We have another question about how do we adjudicate between conflicting truths? Do we, for example, in the context of the Holocaust, want to give equal space to the memory of capos, prisoner functionaries, who were often collaborators in Nazi camps, as well as those who were who were victims of, in a more conventional sense? Everyone is a victim in that context. How do we adjudicate that? That's important. But I want to finish one from a PhD student who's written in, who's asked a question, and I'll just read it out and then ask briefly if anyone wants to jump in, and we'll wrap up with this. It says, I'm working on a PhD on symbolic justice and symbolic reparations and institutional abuse inquiries. I am interested in the panel's views on this in relation to memorialization as a form of justice, and how can victims and survivors better understand, and decision makers better understand, this concept of memorialization and its relation to justice. I don't know, I'm looking, nobody's jumping up and down in their seat. Barry is.
Well, just something very quick. You know, I think in a way it's the ultimate form of justice, memorialization, because I mean, this is what we're saying about history is the fact is that some people's lives and their lives experience were almost deleted, and they were treated in life as though their experience of life wasn't official or didn't matter or wasn't important. And the clearest, most concrete way to counteract somebody who has been muted or written out of history is to write them into history very visibly and very explicitly. So in that sense, I think it's the ultimate form of justice in this case.
Laura.
Yeah, just to add to that, like memorialization is really important, but memorials don't have to be a statue in a park or a stone somewhere. You know, a memorial can be a building that's kept behind. I'm going to keep talking about buildings because that's what I find most important. But I just think it's really important to also remember that memorialization has to be done as a consultative process. It has to be in somewhere that is a public space that people will see. Like putting a plaque on a wall is not really going to cut it in terms of memorialization. Or also memorials can disappear, you know, very quickly as well. So I think it has to be part of a wider process that is also about other forms of redress. It can't just be the only thing that's done.
Oh, I think that's exactly right and important. I think we've come up right against time. I think that's a nice way to finish, because that idea of consultation and consultative is, it strikes me from Elaine's first story about this, that sense of consultation, of being informed and being involved and approaching this through as many channels, the image of the different channels of information. The idea of memorialization is an important way, I think, for all of us to think about how we navigate what I think has been revealed to be very, very tricky terrain, where different needs, different legitimate needs, are trying to be addressed in a way that isn't always satisfactory. And maybe the most obvious beginning point, so obvious in fact, is this idea of consultation with a view to memorialization, but also to doing the different things that need to be done around tribunals, around memorials, around testimony, around preservation. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody very, very much, our panelists, of course, our audience most of all, for joining us for this first Clingen conversation. First of what I hope will be many. We have another scheduled for later in April with details to come in due course. And we hope to be doing more over the next months. So thank you very much for joining us for this first one. We hope to see you again. Thank you very much indeed.